Good morning, class. Dr. Weiss. Hope you enjoyed Chapter 1 and my lectures on it. Now we're up to a short lecture on Chapter 2. And Chapter 2 gets into the responsibilities of arguers. So let's jump right in. So, one thing I'm trying to get across in Chapter 2, to contrast it with Chapter 1, in which I laid out some basic principles of argumentation, is the fact that argumentation is actually an activity, it's a behavior. It involves doing things and accomplishing things in speech or in writing. And as a result, there are certain responsibilities that the arguers have. So argument just doesn't exist in your mind. It's not purely an intellectual activity. It's not just you're thinking up things. You actually do things with argument, and you make claims. You become an advocate. You try to accomplish certain things argumentatively in terms of supporting claims, making inferences, reaching conclusions, drawing the judge or the audience or the reader, or even your interlocutor, which is just a fancy word for your opponent, to the conclusion that you've arrived at through your argumentative means. So once we actually begin the process of having an argument, there are certain responsibilities that you have. As I said in the first chapter, argument is a very rule-based activity. Some of the rules are explicit and are laid out as part of the situation and context to explicitly tell you how you're supposed to behave and what you're supposed to do. Other ideas in argumentation evolve naturally, but are also part of convention, and also have to do with psychological and logical requirements that arguers have in order to achieve their goals. And the first of those responsibilities or requirements is something that's called going forward. Now, what does this mean? Let me give you a real simple example. Let's say you're sitting around having lunch with a bunch of friends, and you start arguing about something. I don't really care what it is. It could be any topic. Let's just say, for example, that you're arguing about whether or not Sony should have tried to stop the press from looking at all those leaked and hacked emails that took place within the last couple weeks. Okay? So you make your best argument, you make your best case, you present your best evidence, you marshal up all your support for what it is you're trying to claim, and then after you're done, you look at your friend, your opponent, whoever you're arguing or discussing the issue with, and that other person simply says, "I'm sorry, you're wrong." And that's the extent of his or her response. Well, that other person, your friend, your opponent, the person you're arguing with, has a responsibility. If he or she is going to engage you in an argument, if they're going to take up their role as an advocate, if they're going to participate in a debate, if there's going to be a back and forth, if there's going to be some sort of a dialect or dialogue going back and forth over the issue, that person has a responsibility to pick up the argument and go with it. And that responsibility is called the requirement of going forward with the argument. So here's another actual type of a situation that would demonstrate that or be an example of that. Let's say, for example, you had been accused of speeding and you decided to hire a lawyer to represent you in court. And you go to court and the prosecutor presents the evidence you've been speeding, and then your attorney gets up and says to the judge, "The defense rests." Well, you probably think that you wasted your money hiring that attorney, because one of the things that we like to think of in terms of advocacy or making arguments is that the person representative is going to come back and have a rejoinder or a rebuttal or a response to the person that has launched an accusation against us or accused us of a crime. So this is a basic responsibility in argument, and that is that if an argument starts, it can't just stop by somebody saying, "Well, you're wrong," or "Okay, I always hate this remark when people say, well, let's just agree to disagree. That's a silly thing to say, because it's basically admitting that you have nothing to come back with. And part of argumentation as a process is that there is a comeback. For every side, there's an opposite side. For every pro, there's a con. For every point, there's a counterpoint. Responsibility number 2, evidence. I think what characterizes argument more than any other thing is the fact that the claims that we make, many of them are ultimately testable against experience, against reality, against data, against observation, and so forth. How many times have you argued with friends or discussed things with friends or tried to remember things, and the way of testing your recollections or your arguments or your claims is to hop on the internet and look up the answer to the question. That's because we require evidence for claims. We require that somebody give something to us that's external, objective, apart from ourselves, apart from our own memories or experiences, or what we just think we know, that which has been published, that which is public, that which is accessible, that which people can find and read. Reference books are a good example of that. If you want to find out who was the 36th president, you could easily find that out. So this is interesting. Now, the kind of dark side of this is it gets us into a whole different debate about what counts as evidence, what's good evidence, what's bad evidence, what's relevant evidence, what's appropriate evidence, what evidence really supports the claim as opposed to seems to support the claim. So this is a really major issue in all studies of argument and debate, and that is, what are you offering as your evidence? Later in the course, when we discuss different types of argument fields, like the fields of science and religion and justice and aesthetics and politics, you'll see that what counts as a claim and what counts as evidence are very different from field to field. For example, in science, we're going to need some very good evidence to make or defend a scientific claim. But in aesthetics, which is the field that has to do with art and artistic preferences, we're going to accept very different types of evidence. We're going to accept personal evidence, or evidence that doesn't necessarily come through testing or observation or science. So this is a good thing to keep in the back of your mind as we go forward with this class, that argument is not one monolithic thing. It's a very different set of criteria and expectations as you move from field to field and subject to subject. Responsibility 3, clash. This is probably the characteristic of argument that makes it the most interesting activity, or the thing that I, as a person who teaches this and studies this, most look for when I am examining an argument or looking at an argument in terms of its interest value, or what can I observe, what can I study. So clash, very simply, is the idea that in an argument, the two opposing viewpoints hit each other head on. They're in a conflict. They don't talk past each other. Their ideas aren't irrelevant to each other. Somebody makes a claim, and somebody else makes a counterclaim, and the counterclaim is actually a direct response to the claim, or vice versa. And this is very important. A lot of times I'll see with a new debater or somebody who's just learning how to argue that their response to an opponent or another argument is very generic, meaning that it doesn't specifically respond to the claims or the arguments that their opponent are making or is making. And it lacks clash. A good argument head-on directly clashes. Arguments don't go past each other in a very generic direction. They actually hit each other head-on, point for point. So if somebody says A, somebody else might be arguing A is not the case, because that would create real clash in argumentation. So one of your responsibilities as an arguer is to clash with your opponent. Responsibility 4, extension. This is a rather sophisticated concept in argumentation, but it is essential, and it is a responsibility. It's the idea that when you're making arguments, you have a requirement or a responsibility to keep enlarging the scope of the argument. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about. Here's an example. Let's say I made an argument that all college students should get free tuition. Okay? And my opponent said, well, that sounds like an interesting idea, but we would never be able to pay for that. There's not enough money in the world to pay for everybody to go to college, right? And my response to my opponent is, well, that's a good answer, except it's still a great idea. Everybody should get to go to college and not have to pay for it. You'll see that my response, even though I've gone forward with the argument, responsibility number one, I haven't really answered the argument. I haven't clashed with it in a way that's required. And the way to clash with that argument and meet my responsibility going forward is to do what's called extending the argument. In other words, enlarging its scope. I now have to take my original claim and I have to add to it the idea that there's more that I can explain to defend my original claim. I have the data, I have the evidence, I have the support that we can afford it, or that affordability is not a big issue, or that the government funds a lot of things it can't afford to do, but we have to have a prioritization of which things are worth spending money on and which aren't. So these are all possible answers, but by just saying I still think it's a great idea, I'm not extending or enlarging the scope of my original claim. Responsibility 5, consistency. Consistency is the idea that you're not saying things that are incompatible or contradictory. As you advance a claim, you have to be a little bit making sure it's a kind of a logical requirement that you're not saying things that are incompatible. Okay. For example, let's say I made the argument that everyone should be allowed to freely express themselves in every classroom, right? That's my argument. And a student makes a comment in my class, and I say, well, that's an interesting comment, but not appropriate for the classroom. All right. Now, somebody could accuse me of inconsistency because on the one hand, I'm saying that everybody should be able to freely express themselves in the classroom. Now somebody has freely expressed themselves in the classroom, and I've told them that their expression is inappropriate or shouldn't be made in a classroom. Now, I will grant you that we could examine whether or not those two claims are compatible, but it seems that on the surface that's a very inconsistent stance. For example, another thing is a professor could say, well, in my class we're all equals and I'm all about democracy and fairness, but then when the professor evaluates you and gives you a grade, you could see that you're not all equals, and it's not all about necessarily fairness and justice. The professor is more powerful than you in that he or she can assign grades, plus other students in the class may be doing better or worse than you are. So there's constantly evaluations which differentiate people. So on the one hand to say everybody's equal, and on the other hand to say that I'm going to make all these differentiations based on power and performance that show that you're not equal, again, might be inconsistent. It's definitely arguable, but it might be an inconsistent stance. That's what I'm saying. These are all very arguable things. The next responsibility is what we call resolution. Very simple. Resolution means that in having an argument, we're trying to get somewhere. We have a destination. We're moving down a track. We're making claims, and our opponent is trying to push us back on that track to a previous position that we've held, hoping that we were not able to advance our claim. So because it's directional, it's moving in a direction, and it's trying to reach some sort of outcome, we tend to think of argumentation in terms of things being resolved or closed or finished, not for all time and forever, but at some point there's a stopping point, a finishing point. When you have a trial, there's a verdict at the end. When you have a debate, a winner is announced. When you have a parliamentary assembly and they debate a motion, they eventually vote on the motion. If you have an election and people are putting out their issues and arguing, at some point the voters weigh in on who won. Argument as an activity is kind of time bound, and it offers people the possibility of resolving the issue. And when they do get it resolved, they're at a stopping point. And I'll say more about that in a later chapter. Alright, so I'm out of time, and I'll continue this on the next page.